Number 5 on this list is Something's in the Sea, a much shorter video game than some of the other ones on this list, but still just as terrifying. Something's in the Sea comes from Yahtzee Croshaw, longtime Lovecraftian horror fan, and the pedigree is apparent. This tense and tightly woven nightmare is his 10th game, and the experience really shows. The game focuses on the lone survivor of a plane crash who now finds themselves stranded in the ocean with nothing but a boat and the pieces of an artifact they are being compelled to reunite. Unfortunately, you won't just be fighting your limited lung capacity to bring the pieces back from the sunken depths. You'll also be trying to escape a massive undersea creature that doesn't appreciate your efforts. There's very little text in this game, and what is there contributes beautifully to the uneasy atmosphere. Apparently, this game really dives deep, no pun intended, on the sea monster that Lovecraft used to love writing about. I mean, his most famous creature, Cthulhu, was based in the sea, so I imagine you'd be getting a lot of different creatures like that in this game as well. And as we know, it's the creatures that make Lovecraft so scary. He certainly had his way with words, and I don't want to take anything away from him in that regard, but I truly believe the thing which brought him the most fame was the fact that he would write about giant, writhing masses of flesh that would resemble some incomprehensible gross thing. In this horror game, you get to travel many feet below the sea and fight these disgusting beasts. Although, if you are faint of heart or find that you have a hard time going to sleep after watching and or playing horror-related things, then I really wouldn't recommend playing this thing. Number 4 on this list is The Consuming Shadow. The name of this game just sounds ominous as hell and like something directly from Lovecraft's mind. Cog Connected says, The Consuming Shadow tasks the player with stopping a shadow that is trying to enter our world. If this ancient is permitted to enter our reality, then it will change the world irrevocably, tearing the very logic of existence asunder. You don't want that to happen, so you grab a shotgun or a book of spells, get into your car, and start looking for clues on which eldritch being is trying to pull a fast one. Gather enough information, save towns from corruption, and kill enough monstrous servants of the ancient, and you'll find a way to seal it. Just be careful. You literally cannot kill this thing, and the game's sanity meter means that if you slip up, you can end up taking your own life in a fit of madness. This game is part retro dungeon crawler, part adventure game, part roguelite, and its horrific atmosphere and writing are excellent. The graphics, much like Something's in the Sea, are deliberately retro. Maybe the game developers didn't intend for this to happen, but a fun side effect of this game is that not only will your in-game sanity slip, but it's possible even your out-of-game real-life sanity could be at risk depending on how long you play for. Retro graphics aren't usually super terrifying, but if they have the right story attached to them and all other elements of the game are rock solid, then they can be. Apparently this game is incredible as far as the horror genre goes and nails literally all of that, which makes this a great game for what it intended itself to be, but also a super scary horror video game that you should be very cautious with if you're the type of person that chooses to play it. Number 3 on this list is Fallen London. This one is just about guaranteed to keep you up at night if you choose to play it. Cog Connected says, Fallen London may be the best browser game out there. It's certainly the best steampunk / Lovecraftian horror / comedy browser game. In this game, London has been stolen, or perhaps sold, and buried deep within the earth. The Neath is dark, dank, and so far from the sun that the laws which govern existence are beginning to break down. You find yourself in a realm where death rarely sticks. Hell is just a train ride away, and the giant alien bats who now own London will pay top dollar for love stories. It's a sprawling world filled with countless quests and story hooks, some of which are heartwarming, some of which chill the blood. Most of the story Fallen London has to offer range from delightfully creepy to mildly discomforting, but some of it will leave you sleeping with the lights on. Go on, seek Mr. Eaton's name, I dare you. This game is constantly being added to and expanded on, and at this point, I'm afraid to estimate how long a full playthrough might actually take. The evil monsters and their designs here are all based off of a Lovecraftian horror, and even though this game isn't expressly dealing with Cthulhu or anything like that, it has been classified in that genre. It is a very scary game that you can get sucked into. Problem is that it's hard to remember what reality is and completely leave the game once you're done playing. Images of Lovecraftian monsters and evil hell bat things will cycle through your mind as you're trying to live your everyday life. If that sounds like fun to you, then go ahead, play it. If you do play it though, can you tell me all about it please? Because I for one will not be partaking in a playthrough myself. Number 2 on this list is The Darkest Dungeon. So this game walks an interesting line between gothic horror and Lovecraftian horror, which makes it all the more scary in my opinion. Cog Connected says, in this game you play as the heir to a dilapidated and monster-infested estate, directing a group of flawed heroes to try to make up for your ancestors' terrible mistake. Seeing as the estate is now absolutely infested with the undead and more esoteric, sanity-destroying foes, keeping these heroes alive and sane is easier said than done. The focus on the many ways your hero can self-destruct makes this game genuinely uncomfortable at times. Darkest Dungeon sets out to address the psychological stress of adventuring, and good lord, does it succeed in making dungeon diving seem like the worst job in the world. Even being night guard at Freddy Fazbear's might be preferable, and the ancient portal under the estate is still threatening to let terrible things into our world. Gothic horror and that genre has always been particularly scary to me, so mixing that with the always terrifying and gruesome Lovecraftian stuff, that really makes it a match made in scary heaven. I think that the best word to describe this game is truly uncomfortable. Even at the low points of the plot, you never really feel like you can sit comfortably. There's always something just around the corner waiting to get you, and it just gives the person playing this an overwhelming sense of anxiety all the time. And finally, number 1 on this list is The Call of Cthulhu. This is probably the most famous Lovecraftian horror video game maybe ever. The breakdown of the game is as follows. Private investigator Pierce is sent to look into the tragic death of the Hawkins family on the isolated Darkwater Island. Plunge into a world of creeping madness and shrouded old gods within Lovecraft's iconic universe. Your mind will suffer, balancing a razor-thin line between sanity and psychosis. Cryptic clues, shadowy figures, and pure terror bar your way as you fight to retain your sanity and solve an otherworldly mystery. I watched the trailer for this game, and it is unsettling to say the least. I haven't personally played it because that would kind of go against the title of this video, but damn, it looks like a lot, guys. Like, the main character goes through a freaking roller coaster of emotions during that trailer, so I can only imagine what the full game experience is really like. During the trailer, there are a bunch of lines of text that flash up, basically little highlights of reviews that people have made of the game. Terrifying, unsettling, horrifying, will keep you up at night. These are just a few of the things that those reviews were constantly saying. Obviously, this game is a masterpiece in the Lovecraftian horror genre, but it might be a little too good. Lovecraft stuff is scary enough just in my imagination, let alone playing it all out. If any of you folks have actually played this game before, then I would love to hear about it firsthand. Do you recommend it, or should we stay away?
Number 5, Left 4 Dead 2. Up first on our list is Left 4 Dead 2, the sequel to Valve's 2008 smash hit Left 4 Dead. Left 4 Dead 2 changed the game entirely, revolutionizing the zombie genre and reinventing everything you knew about Left 4 Dead by taking the exact same game and setting it in Louisiana instead of Pennsylvania. Now, the actual game is amazing. I could hark sweet nothings about Left 4 Dead all day. The 4-player co-op zombie survival game was some of the most fun you could have with an internet connection back in the day. I probably lost hundreds of hours of my 8th grade playing Left 4 Dead 2. But if you happen to live somewhere like Australia or Germany, you wouldn't been able to have played Left 4 Dead 2 at all, since because of its intense depictions of violence, the game was deemed too heinously gory to be sold, classifying it as too violent to be sold as an MA-15 game, the highest rating Australia had at the time. Valve tried to fight back against the classification as much as they could, insisting that all the violence depicted in the game was against zombies, who are no longer human. They just look like humans and fall apart pretty easily. The workaround? Valve released a heavily censored release of Left 4 Dead 2 for international markets, which removes just about everything yucky. No missing limbs, no guts, gore, blood, and piles of bodies are all gone out of the Australian release. Oddly, and possibly as an apology for removing content, the German release of Left 4 Dead 2 also heavily censored all the violence, features weaponry not available in any other releases of the game, all ported over from Counter-Strike's source. Pretty funny to note as well, the cover art for Left 4 Dead 2 is a severed hand missing a couple fingers, with 2 fingers held up to denote that it's Left 4 Dead 2, like this. Well, because that gesture is considered rude in England, the cover was replaced there with a variant where the hand is facing backwards. And hey, on the off chance anybody from Valve's watching, if you guys wouldn't mind, I really would like another Left 4 Dead. Don't forget to subscribe for more horror content coming your way every day. Number 4. Silent Hill Homecoming. Silent Hill has always been one of the most terrifying video game series on the planet. When you think of the hulking Pyramid Head or any of the other flesh monstrosities that wander the restless dreams of that town, Silent Hill has always been good at making your hair stand on end. Silent Hill Homecoming was the 5th Silent Hill released, and the first by a studio that wasn't Team Silent. The player is put into the boots of Alex Shepard, a Spec Ops combat veteran returning to his hometown, not of Silent Hill, but its neighboring town of Shepherd's Glen. It's a homecoming, if you will. Now the actual game is okay. I'm too close to Silent Hill to speak about the series fairly. I wouldn't say it's the scariest Silent Hill, and it's not the best, but it's also not the worst. It's kind of just right in the middle. But it's the only game in the series that was ever outright banned. The game contains some pretty intense violence, probably the goriest entry in the series, I would say. A scene in particular depicts our hero Alex struggling against a cultist enemy, and if Alex fails the event, Alex gets a drill into him violently, and if he succeeds, the cultist gets the drill, so either way, somebody is losing bad. And that someone is the nations of Australia, Germany, and Japan, as the game was refused classification for Australia and Germany, and speaking of which, those two are going to come up a lot on this list, as they really do not like violence in their games. Japan is a little more confusing, as I couldn't find why the game was never sold in Japan. Violence doesn't usually tend to get a game banned in Japan, so it's unknown why it was never available there. But to our Japanese viewers, I gotta say, you're really not missing out on too much. Don't worry. Number 3. Agony. Agony, 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 agony. I was working at a video game store when this one came out, and boy do I remember the controversy around it. Our store only got a single copy of the game. Agony was a 2018 survival horror game that set out on a mission to be the most disgusting game ever released, and in a lot of ways, they achieved that. Agony follows the story of a lost soul condemned to hell with no memory of their former life, and like anyone who'd be trapped in hell, are trying fruitlessly to escape. Agony's main selling point was its intense depiction of hell, overflowing with blood, gore, fire, and brimstone. Agony is pretty much non-stop gooey gore from the second the game starts. The game was actually heavily censored before even being released, as initial ratings of Agony received the infamous adults only rating, which would have prevented it from being sold in major retailers or online platforms. So the final product had to be heavily edited just to even meet the M17 rating, the highest rating the ESRB gives out. I feel like it's worth throwing this out there if you're hearing about this and you think that I made Agony sound kinda cool and you want to check the game out. I'll let you know that the controversy seems like it was more a marketing thing because the actual game is kind of bad. For all its overwhelming gore, it gets really dull fast. You know, you walk into one room full of nightmarish, incomprehensible walls of 1,000 wretched faces screaming and crying blood, and really, you've seen them all, you know? The game gets pretty samey really fast, and the actual gameplay is really dull despite its environments. After its release, it became clear that Agony was nothing more than a maypole for controversy. Number 2. Condemned: Criminal Origins. Condemned: Criminal Origins was a launch title for the Xbox 360 all the way back in 2005. So I wouldn't be surprised if you forgot about it. It was a first-person survival horror game where you played a detective built like a linebacker, hunting a serial murderer on the trail of a series of condemned buildings, obviously, all the while being attacked by populations of the city who have all gone violently mad by some mysterious force. Now, Condemned is probably the scariest game on this list, and I'd go so far as to say it's one of the scariest games I've ever played in my life, drawing major inspiration from films like Seven, Silence of the Lambs, and Saw. Condemned is the kind of game that makes you feel like you'd need to take a boiling shower afterwards and scrub yourself. The game is entirely in a first-person perspective, and you really feel like you are knee-deep in the filthy grime of the city. So what banned Condemned? Well, in Germany, the game was refused to be sold because of a law stating that any depictions of cruel or otherwise inhuman acts of violence against human beings in a manner which expresses a glorification, which really could describe any of the video games I listed today. Interestingly, unlike a lot of the other ones on this list, Condemned was actually banned after it was released, not before. Its sequel, Condemned Bloodshot, was also banned for the exact same reasons. Now for what it's worth, Condemned is pretty vile and pretty scary. It's a testament to how disturbing the game is in its depictions of horror, foregoing supernatural elements and trying to depict the situation as realistically as possible. You do have to admit, it is kind of ironic too that when you think about it, the game itself was condemned. Still, nonetheless, if you're feeling brave and up for it, I would recommend checking it out. It is horrifying. Number 1. Manhunt. There could not have been any other game at number 1 on the list about banned horror video games. If you're passionate about horror games and you know your horror game history, you were probably already expecting for Manhunt to show up. When you really think about it, Manhunt is probably one of the most infamous video games ever released. Manhunt comes to us from Rockstar Games, who are definitely no stranger to controversy, being the developers behind Grand Theft Auto. If anything, they welcome controversy, even going so far as in the early days paying for bad reviews for the GTA games to make them seem cooler. A contraband video game, what kid wouldn't want that? Well, Manhunt was a similar situation. Almost all of Rockstar's games see you playing a criminal of some kind, be it a thug, an outlaw, or a high school bully. But Manhunt has you playing as a death row inmate who is kidnapped by a sick benefactor known as the Director, who communicates to you through an earpiece, and in exchange for your freedom, wants to watch you take out members of various gangs across the city while he watches you on hijacked CCTV cameras for his sick pleasure. As the player fights off depraved gangsters, criminals, and one particularly memorable delusional chainsaw-wielding naked pig mask-wearing psychopath, you'll find yourself caught in a grisly web. Now, video game violence has always been a very touchy subject. What is too realistic? Where is the line? Manhunt very intentionally walked that line. A quote from ex-Rockstar developer Jeff Williams, who contributed to Manhunt, had this to say: "The game just made us all feel icky. It was all about the violence, and it was about realistic violence. We all knew there was no way we could explain away this game. We all knew we were crossing a line. There was almost a mutiny in the staff over it." A Manhunt sees the player executing people for the pleasure of the Director, all using household objects and disturbingly realistic depictions of violence. Infamously, Manhunt was involved in a real-life tragic death, with the assailant having been purported to have been obsessed with the game by friends, which led to efforts to have the game banned outright from stores. In New Zealand, owning Manhunt was actually considered a criminal charge. You could get charged for having this video game in your home. The province of Ontario restricted Manhunt to the dreaded AO rating, pulling it from store shelves. Despite the intense nature of the game and the controversy surrounding it, Manhunt went on to be a cult classic. It sold well, it wasn't banned as widespread as Rockstar had feared, and to this day, it still even has its fans. It sold and reviewed well enough to even get a sequel, which very bizarrely was exclusive to the Nintendo Wii, a console exclusively known for its family-friendly entertainment. Nothing more family-friendly than Manhunt. Starting off at number 5, Colat. Colat is a Polish horror game released in 2015 and is the most directly inspired by real events of any of the games on this list, putting you in the shoes of an explorer setting out to uncover the truth and close the case on the Dilatov Pass incident, a mystery that's plagued and terrified people for 60 years. 9 Russian college students disappeared under incredibly mysterious circumstances in the winter while trekking out in the mountains. This is of course based on the real-life Dilatov Pass incident where this exact thing happened. A group of friends went out for a trek in the mountains, and after no word was heard from the group for nearly a month, a search party set out, and after months and months of searching the mountains, eventually police found the remains of the hikers. 6 had passed from hypothermia, and 3 of them had horrific internal injuries. It's a very famous case, and I invite you to read about it after this video because it is fascinating and terrifying, and no one had gotten to the bottom of it, so it seemed like a good setting for a survival horror mystery game that's also narrated by Sean Bean for some reason. Yeah, Sean Bean narrates this one. I don't know why, but because he's the narrator, he can't die, so he's got that going for him. While the most common hypothesis is that the group suffered under an avalanche, the game offers a much more complex narrative than that, featuring a bit of government conspiracy, supernatural dealings, and all the usual checklist stuff you'd expect from an indie Steam horror game. I've never actually played it, so I can't comment on it too much. I did watch the trailer, looks pretty cool, but I like to throw in one indie game in these lists that nobody's ever heard of. Check Colat Colat out. Go give it a shot. And if you're enjoying all the content we're putting out, first of all, thank you very much. But might I suggest subscribing or clicking through for loads more horror content? We got loads of videos and we love the clicks. Let's keep going. Number 4, Outlast. Nothing is scarier than being alone in a dark hospital at night. And it's made even worse when all the patients are deranged and violent from years of government-sanctioned brainwashing. That's Outlast. If you haven't played Outlast, you play as an intrepid journalist who goes off to investigate an asylum after an anonymous whistleblower sends you a tip to go check it all out because something freaky is happening up there. So you do, and in classic horror video game guy fashion, you only bring a camera with you and nothing else, and don't even tell anyone you're going. You barely even bring batteries. You discover that the asylum has gone downhill, to say the least, and the inmates are running the asylum and are all too far gone to even know what's happening anymore, and are all violently hostile to outsiders. We learn as we venture through the halls that all the inmates have been experimented on by a cruel corporation trying to research the usual super soldier stuff, using all sorts of immoral research to try and activate extrasensory powers on people. Now, of course, Outlast does get pretty fantastical and horrifying, and I don't want to spoil too much, but eventually you are like running away from ghosts and psychic conscious monsters, which, as far as I know, doesn't exist. But the horrors of Outlast, the really scary stuff, isn't the bloody patients or monsters, it's the fact that they were experimented on by questionable government scientists for the ridiculous purpose of creating psychic super soldiers. Which would sound like a video game plot if it wasn't for the CIA's MK Ultra, Montauk, and Project Gateway programs, which are all very real, very documented instances when the CIA tried to research how possible it was to make someone psychic. Look this up when this video is done, okay? The infamous projects have served as the inspiration for a few things, with Montauk and MK Ultra directly inspiring the Netflix series Stranger Things. Sometimes the strangest things are the things that really happen. But the strangest thing about Outlast? Why does your guy never try to fight back, even once? He only has the camera, I get that, but he's not even gonna try picking up a pipe or something. He's got feet, he's got hands, I don't know, I'm still bothered about this, we gotta move on. Number 3, Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl. Well, given the title of the game, I bet if you really think about it, you can probably imagine what true event Stalker is based on. But if you're not a fan of GSC's ultra brutal apocalypse RPG horror series, Stalker, which is an acronym for Scavengers, Trespassers, Adventurers, and I honestly can't remember the rest. Anyway, you play a stalker, someone who traverses the hostile irradiated hellscape known as the Zone, the surrounding areas around Chernobyl, which have become host to all sorts of threats from zombies, mutants, bandits, and radiation. It paints a pretty grim scenario. In the world of Stalker, the Chernobyl incident occurred the same way it did in our real world. Mismanagement and improperly constructed equipment led to a disastrous accident that irradiated the surrounding area, causing everyone to evacuate and causing a state of emergency. Where the timelines differ is that in Stalker, after this accident, some secret Soviet scientists go back to Chernobyl to use it as a lab to conduct all sorts of nefarious experiments that eventually lead to a collapse in reality, tearing open some holes, anomalies everywhere, an even bigger disaster, letting loose all manner of monster and mutant onto the surrounding areas. Such is life in the Zone. Obviously, things didn't get this bad in the real world, and as far as I know, there's no bloodsuckers lurking in Pripyat. I've never been, but you know, I've heard. But the real Chernobyl incident was about as horrifyingly close to a full-on apocalyptic incident as we've ever come. Interestingly too, as another little Stalker tidbit, Stalker is very loosely inspired by a piece of classic Russian cinema. Unless you've got a Criterion Channel subscription, maybe you didn't know this, but the 1979 film Stalker, which is set in a hostile, strange environment where the laws of physics no longer apply, is led by scavengers who hunt through the strange land called the Zone. There's not a lot of post-apocalyptic mercenaries fighting zombies, and mostly it's just kind of esoteric musings. It's loosely inspired, but it's still very much worth noting if you're a big fan of grim dystopian European media, and if you like Stalker, you'll probably like the other Stalker. Moving on. Number 2, Fatal Frame. Fatal Frame was a series of survival horror games that put the player in control of various investigators in 1980s Japan, revolving around taking photos to find ghosts, plain and simple. The games are downright horrifying, with the developer's original intended mission statement being to make the scariest game possible, and there's quite a few fans who would agree with that. Although there's been a bunch of Fatal Frame games, the one we're going to be taking a look at is the very first. The first game in the series was largely inspired by a real Japanese urban legend ghost story, The Legend of Himuro Mansion. The story goes that a long time ago, a family lived in Himuro Mansion who participated in a strange ritual called the the strangling ritual, which would seal off bad energy from within the earth. The family would choose a maiden, isolate her from the rest of the world to not attach her to the earth at all, thinking that this was part of the ritual if she got too connected to the material world. On the day of the ritual, she was bound by ropes and attached to horses, and you honestly don't want to know what comes next. The last ritual performed by the family ran into a bit of a hitch when the maiden fell in love with a man who tried to save her, leading to the patriarch of the family raising his blade to the maiden, then on his own family, then himself. The story goes that if you take a photo of the Himuro mansion, you're able to see a ghost in the frame, which is what directly inspired the main gameplay mechanic of Fatal Frame, taking photos of ghosts. Now, I wouldn't feel super right if I didn't mention the tagline that boasts that Fatal Frame is based on a true story was only ever included in the North American release of the game, not the Japanese or European ones. So either it is inspired by this urban legend, or that was just something they put on the box to sell a cool game. Either way, Fatal Frame rules, and that's really all there is to it. And number 1, Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil has always been one of my all-time favorite series, and Resident Evil Village was like a kiss from Capcom on the cheek as a longtime fan. It was like RE4 and RE7 had a beautiful baby. It's probably the most out there the series has ever got, trading out the usual zombies and tentacle monsters for fairy tale horrors, werewolves, ogres, and a very tall vampire who I'm pretty sure at least 50% of the audience already knows a lot about. But as fantastical as Resident Evil Village is, did you know how much of it was inspired on reality? Yeah, well, okay, somewhat. First and foremost, the infamous Castle Dimitrescu was directly inspired by a real castle in the Carpathians where the game is set, Castle Pelish. If you look at some comparison images, it is like the spitting image down to the layout of the interior of the castle. Make sure to check those drawers for red herbs and ammo if you're ever passing through. Well, what about the lady of the manor, Miss Lady Dimitrescu herself? Well, tragically, there aren't any 9-foot-tall vampire women, and if there are, call me. Art director Tomonoro Takano shed a bit of light on the inspiration for the very infamous lady. Her impressive stature is based on a Japanese urban legend called Hachisu Hakasama, an 8-foot-tall woman with long black hair wearing a long white dress and a big brimmed hat. The Hachisu Hakasama lures men away by imitating the voices of their loved ones. While Dimitrescu never lures Ethan away this way, she does hold his baby hostage, so she's got the holding your loved ones thing down pat. But this urban legend wasn't the only inspiration for the lady of the manor. Dimitrescu is inspired directly by Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian countess of infamous renown, who is thought to be an occultist, a vampire, a demon, or something evil. Bathory was legendarily cruel, and would take great pleasure in the pain she inflicted on her victims. She allegedly would bathe in blood from the peasant girls she'd abducted, and would bite them and subject them to unbelievable cruelty. Lady Dimitrescu's castle features a massive bathtub of blood directly inspired by this legend, not to mention the medieval torture cellar she keeps down below in the basement. Lady Bathory never had claws or a second form in her boss fight, but she was undeniably one of the scariest women to ever live. And sometimes the truth is way scarier than the fictions. Number 5, Resident Evil 3.5. When Resident Evil 4 came out in 2005, it seemed like space-age technology. The game didn't look like anything else. Its unique third-person camera and focus on tight gunplay made it feel unique, tense, like the action was up close and personal. Since then, pretty much every big budget action game owes a little something to Resident Evil 4. If we didn't have Leon S. Kennedy spin-kicking farmers in rural Spain, we wouldn't have The Last of Us, Dead Space, Uncharted, God of War, Bioshock. All of these games, developers have openly admitted were influenced and inspired by RE4's wild leaps in game design. So it's fascinating to think that a slightly different timeline could have played out if we had something different. The first ever gameplay demo for Resident Evil 4, referred to as Resident Evil 3.5 or Hallucination or the Hookman demo, is a small little peer into a world where Resident Evil 4 stuck to the same style of gameplay as the original game, with a fixed camera perspective and a stronger focus on horror in ways the series hadn't ever seen before. And there were no zombies or mutant crocodiles or any of the usual flesh monsters this time around. Instead, we saw series mainstay Leon going against what looked like ghosts and the supernatural, cursed dolls, and, if the demo's to be believed, his own mind. In this build of the game, Leon is infected with a virus that causes him to hallucinate, manifesting in you fighting enemies that weren't even there. It's a really cool idea, and one that wouldn't show up again until Resident Evil Village, all the way in 2022, nearly 20 years after the demo was first shown off in 2003. Now, unfortunately for Resident Evil diehards like yours truly, this E3 demo is all we ever got of the Hallucination or Hookman build. No playable version has ever come out, nor are we even really aware if it ever truly did exist, or if all of this was more of a mock-up proof of concept. Now, in the end, we got the right game. Resident Evil 4 was a once-in-a-lifetime magnum opus of game design. It's probably my favorite game of all time. I think I've played it more than I've had hot dinners, and I'm glad it's the one we got. But it's fun to think about what could have been. In the 2 years between this footage and the final release of the game was unrecognizable, changing literally everything except the protagonist and his amazing leather jacket and haircut, leaving us only able to speculate what would it have been like if we got this one instead. Would we have seen a golden era of haunted baby games? And if you're looking for more top scary content, hey, may I recommend Top 5 Scary? We've got horror games, horror movies, monsters, ghosts, goblins, UFOs, pretty much everything scary under the sun, and even above it too. So click through and I am certain you'll find something worth screaming at. Number 4, Rule of Rose. Now this one is a tiny bit of a cheat, since of all the games on this list, this one is probably the most you can actually play. But it's a more unknown horror game, so I wanted to stick it in there because who knows the next time I'll be able to talk about it. Rule of Rose was a PS2 game developed by Punchline Studios, a very small Japanese game studio whose only other video game developed was a very cute game named Tulip about being a mailman. Nobody's ever heard of it, it's adorable, the Game Grumps played it if you want to check it out. Well, aside from that, their other game was Rule of Rose, a game about being tortured and trapped in an esoteric fairy tale world run by young girls who have developed classism, so they have consistent themes. It takes some big cues from Lord of the Flies, telling a society of English youth in ruins. The plot is, it's hard to summarize, and there's no way I'd be able to do it justice in 2 minutes, so let's just say it's very esoteric, it's open to interpretation, takes a lot of cue from fairy tales, and it's scary in a way a lot of scary games aren't. The team's goal was to create a new type of horror game, citing the Brothers Grimm and their fairy tales and Silent Hill as their main inspiration for horror. Now, Rule of Rose is an interesting case for why it's forbidden, because a lot of the controversy surrounding this game wasn't actually in the game, but rather stemmed from rumor and panic over this alleged content. You know, early reporters had wrote that the game featured inappropriate eroticism, obscene brutality, despite the fact that none of these things actually happen in the game. The game was a victim of its own perceived reputation, and it was banned across Europe from being sold. It was cancelled outright in the United Kingdom, France, Australia, New Zealand, and a few other little countries here and there. Justice Minister of the European Union, Franco Frattini, he spoke out about this incident, saying he was disappointed he wasn't consulted before it was outright banned. And he used the game as an example as to why government officials need to meet and discuss with gaming industry representatives to ensure they're not censoring content and maintaining freedom of expression, citing that he felt most officials who spoke so fiercely about Rule of Rose had not actually seen any of the game's alleged content, but was basing it off of promotional media or rumor. That's oddly fitting, I think, that the people making rules about it didn't even bother reading anything about it, just banning it outright. No, they're just like gamers getting mad at stuff they haven't played. Now, you're not outright forbidden from playing Rule of Rose, but good luck getting a copy. It's not available on any digital marketplaces, and physical copies for the original release tend to start at around $200. So if you're curious about it, you can always open up another tab on YouTube and try and watch a Let's Play. Much cheaper. Number 3, Dead by Daylight and Stranger Things. Now, if you're a horror fan and a horror gaming fan, the odds are pretty good you've got a few hours logged on Dead by Daylight. Or if you're like your charming host here, you've got somewhere around, I think we're hitting the 500-hour mark. That's all I do when I'm not filming. It is a horror fan's best dream. It's a multiplayer game that pits horror's best heroes, like Ash Williams or Jill Valentine, against horror's nastiest monsters like Michael Myers, Jigsaw, Ghostface, and way more in a 4v1 experience that is just unlike anything else. It's frequently copied, but nobody does it like they do. One of the coolest things about keeping up with Dead by Daylight is that every few months, developer Behavior drops a massive content pack to keep the game fresh, usually featuring some new playable characters on both sides, some new maps, and most of the time they're original characters from the team, but the most exciting ones are the ones where we get to play horror icons, like the Stranger Things cast. One of the biggest chapters in Dead by Daylight was the Stranger Things crossover, featuring the Demogorgon as a playable monster, Steve Harrington and Nancy Wheeler as playable survivors, and a brand new realm in Hawkins' Lab and the Upside Down. The characters looked amazing, and like most of the licenses in Dead by Daylight, the team did an amazing job translating the characters' personality through their gameplay. Like the Demogorgon's unique power as it digs through tunnels in the Upside Down, or for example, Steve Harrington's perk set kind of reinforces him as a babysitter. You know, you get all these perks to help out the team and kind of take hits for other people, and the map was lovingly recreated, immersive, and it felt ripped right out of the show. Fans of Dead by Daylight and Stranger Things were thrilled up until 2021, when Behavior lost the license for the Stranger Things content, meaning Hawkins, Steve, Nancy, and the Demogorgon all had to be pulled from the game. Now, if you'd already paid for them, you could still keep them as playable characters, but if you hadn't bought them, then you are completely out of luck. They are gone, and there is no way to access them in the game whatsoever. Now, Steve and Nancy, it's sad, but their skills at least got added to the general survivor pool, but the Demogorgon and Hawkins are a really sad loss, as that's unique content to the game that is totally inaccessible. Hopefully someday the trio can return to the game, or even a new Stranger Things chapter. I would be stoked if they added like Vecna as a playable character or Hopper as a survivor. It's an idea for you there. Here's hoping the license come back. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but I'm gonna keep speculating. You know, stranger things have happened. If you got what I was doing there, it's like a little pun on the show. We'll move on. Number 2, Sad Satan. With a title that immediately sets off something in your head and graphics that look like they're not from this timeline, Sad Satan is an incredibly evocative game wrapped in mystery. We've talked about it before on this channel, but it's a very bizarre piece of internet history that's worth exploring time and again. The story surrounding Sad Satan is probably more interesting than the actual game itself to me. The gameplay is pretty rudimentary, the graphics are primitive, and on a first pass, you'd be forgiven for not having too much to write home about. You walk down a simple linear corridor, and there's these NPCs that look like little crying people. They line the halls, and there's weird jump scares that'll come out at you. You'd think that this was just somebody's student project. Well, except for all the really strange stuff inside the game. Recordings of infamous criminals like Jimmy Savile or Charles Manson. You can be heard speaking. There's images of victims of crimes, accidents, blood-curdling screams, audio from a Swedish radio number station, and a lot of references to real-life criminal acts. Now here's where things get odd. Sad Satan was first discovered by a now defunct YouTube channel called The Obscure Horror Corner, who posted a let's play of the game. And this was pretty much the first time anyone had ever seen it online. Obscure Horror Corner had said that he'd received a tip for the game from an anonymous source, and that it had come from the deep web. The game garnered attention very quickly for its mysterious and creepy content. Shortly afterwards, someone online claimed that the game that had been reported on wasn't the true version of the game, and that the true version of the game existed out there and featured much more illegal, darker content. Versions of this game were passed around chat rooms and forums claiming to be the real one. Some of these variants would contain things like illegal material or malicious software to brick your computer outright. Shortly after Sad Satan first became known, the Obscure Horror Corner disappeared, leading to a lot of mass guessing. Did he feel guilt and responsibility that this unknown game that should have been forgotten was being passed around because of his attention and it was getting people harmed? Was he the original creator of the game and he was looking for a way to virally market his creation? Like most things surrounding Sad Satan, no one knows for sure, and the mystery surrounding it almost is the game. And number 1, PT. It had to be, right? Our first entry had to be PT. Maybe the most instantly recognizable forbidden horror game, as unless you already have the playable teaser installed on your PS4, there is no way to play the game, which is a tragedy of the highest order, since what little we were given of PT is a near masterpiece. Please forgive me, I am about to wax very poetic and very nerdy for something I am way too passionate about. Everyone and their baby knows PT was a proof of concept demo for a revival of the Silent Hill franchise, being helmed by Metal Gear Solid's visionary and all-around weird creator Hideo Kojima, alongside the immensely talented lover of the macabre, Guillermo del Toro, as well starring Norman Reedus as the protagonist. For horror fans, this was like the ultimate gift and then some. Silent Hill had been on ice for years, and everyone was curious about what Kojima was going to be doing now that Metal Gear Solid had been retired. Kojima had openly talked about wanting to do a horror project, and in the middle of 2015, a mysterious game appeared for free on the PlayStation Store dubbed PT from a development studio no one had ever heard of. The game was short and incredibly simple and is relentlessly terrifying. To date, it's probably one of the single scariest digital experiences I've ever played. You're trapped in a hallway of a suburban house, trying desperately to escape, and you're being pursued by the ghost of an extremely upset woman hunting you who may be your dead wife. It's classic Silent Hill stuff. Each time you get to the end of the hallway, you find yourself back at the start, only each loop changes more and more, getting more horrifying and outwardly disturbing. The atmosphere of this game is like a mile thick. They did so much with so little. Now, that same year, after after PT had been announced and won everybody over, and before the release of Metal Gear 5, it came out that Kojima had been let go from Konami, the owners of Silent Hill and Metal Gear. After Kojima's firing, the project was scrapped altogether, and the game was pulled from digital marketplaces and pretty much scrubbed from the internet. So if you didn't get a chance to play PT, the best you can do is look up a YouTube Let's Play of it and hold up a controller and pretend. Now, while we'll never get to play this Kojima Del Toro Ritas collaboration, Death Stranding released in 2019, and it is just chock full of Guillermo Del Toro, Norman Reedus, fetuses, bizarre horror, monster energy, peeing, walking, whales, and lots of walking around hills to beautiful Icelandic indie music. And if any of those things sound appealing to you, you should definitely play it, because Death Stranding was great and everybody slept on it. And this year's Silent Hill is coming back, and while Kojima's not directing, the games we're getting do look amazing, from the remake of Silent Hill 2 to the all-new Silent Hill F. It has never been a better time to be a fan of either of those creators.